Okay. Well, also checking also the judges that they're both here. Jess, are you here?
I'm here.
Adip Fatin, are you here?
Adip here.
Cool. Without further ado, oh, just some preliminary stuff then. Be sure to indicate your POI preference. If you want to indicate your gender preference, respect both POI preference and gender preference if indicated. Other than that, good luck, and I welcome the Prime Minister of the Open Grand Finals. You're here.
Okay, am I audible?
You're audible.
Thank you. If anyone wants to POI, please do so through the chat. I'm going to be taking one from closing opposition, if you have any. If not, then from O. Right, setting up my timer first. All right, I'm gonna begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Several pieces of clarification before I move on to my argumentation. Number one, what most likely is going to be the art is going to be looking like under our world is that artists can have the full freedom to actually express what they want. For example, ladies and gentlemen, that is to say that when they make art for art's sake, for example, they don't need to like constrain that art to a certain political issue or a certain issue in society, for example, meaning that they have more freedom to write whatever they want. Second, that doesn't necessarily mean that you cannot like write about a certain, you cannot like write or like you cannot like sing or you cannot like paint about a certain issue in society, for example, or like you want to tell something about the state of humanity right now, but that doesn't need to come at the expense of like you hinging that art to that every single art has to have a certain utilitarian value to begin with. That is to say that if an art can actually have a utilitarian value under art side, that's fine, but not all art should actually have that, and that art should be made for art's sake, ladies and gentlemen. Thirdly, though, most likely what this debate is about is that most likely it's not going to be talking about the mechanization on how we actually change people's mind in regard to certain pieces of art. Most likely we as artists, for example, do not have the political power to actually change people's mind that you should view an art a certain way, or that not all art should be utilitarian, for example. But notice that this debate, the mass be debated about the philosophy, with stuff. That is to say that even if we do not have any, feasibility on us practicing this in society, at the very least, the philosophy of art for art's sake in and of itself is already good for artists to celebrate, and that is what we want art to be. Even if we don't create that, and if we can prove the benefit of how this particular philosophy is good for artists in and of itself, we already take this debate. Two arguments then. Number one, how do we actually incent how we can actually propose the freedom of artists to create what they want or under outside the house? And secondly, how do we think that the aesthetic value of art and the enjoyment of the art, creating more buy-in to the artist's work, can actually exist under outside the house? Number one, we think that the artists obviously want more freedom to express what they want, ladies and gentlemen. Why is this the case? Because we think that art is a method for artists to actually express their own identity and express their own creativity, ladies and gentlemen, right? But how is it constrained right now in the status quo? Two reasons. Number one, because most likely if you go for a utilitarian value under the opposition side, ladies and gentlemen, artists usually have a limited number of paintings or limited number of like things that they can create. Why? Because you always have to make that art have a certain value to society. That is to say that you have to make that art criticizing a certain policy, for example, or that art has to be a profound exploration of the state of humanity, for example, and to like for humans to actually see what humanity is about. All those things, right? But we think that not all artists actually want to opt in into the particular matter, because not all artists are, for example, keen in that particular subject matter, or some artists just want to create art or that speaks to them but doesn't necessarily have any utilitarian value. And when in comparison, and if we actually get the art for art's sake philosophy, for example, I think that this fits into what artists want, because they can actually create anything they want, even if it's only like a toilet or whatever, ladies and gentlemen. If it's like if it gives them satisfaction that they are able to like create this piece of art to begin with, even if no one else like likes that art or no one else like thinks that art has any value at all to society, and actually make an art, for example, even if that art it's not linked to any political issue or whatever, because people think, and the philosophy of people is that if the artists actually think that art always have certain utilitarian value, for example, most likely that piece of art is always going to be linked to a certain issue, for example, maybe a certain policy, maybe a certain people, or etc. list in them, right? So even if your art has nothing to do with the issues at hand or the controversial issue in society, some art may be actually be interpreted as such, because most people think, because the philosophy there under opposition is that art always has some utilitarian value, for example, meaning that you drag down the meaning of the art itself, and you drag this artist to have to be able to make sure that this art is as the wrong meaning in of itself, for example, is in the which limits the expression of the artist to begin with, right? So that's why the freedom of artists under opposition is going to be less likely to happen. But secondly, there, and I think this is the most important argument, right? Because I think that the other reason as to why artists actually create art to begin with is to actually get recognition and to actually make sure that many people can enjoy the art, for example, is environment. Why is it the case? Why is it the case then that under opposition side, there's going to be less people that want to enjoy that art to begin with, right? Why? Because number one, right? Because notice that the art, for example, if it has certain utilitarian value, most likely it cannot exactly, because if you have less people actually trying to enjoy that art is in a different way, for example, is in the market, you actually can get more recognition. That is to say that because there's more people that can actually accepting that art, for example, there's going to be a lot more number of people that can actually, they're getting into stardom, for example. The reason as to why this is the case, for example, is yes, even if people still have different, interpretation of art under outside the house, that particular interpretation will exactly not going to be toxic under outside. Why? Because no one knows what the hell a good art is, right? No one knows whether this particular shape or this shape of color, for example, is perfect for that particular one of art itself. So most likely, the discourse is not going to be whether or not this piece of art is wrong, for example, but whether or not this piece of art, for example, has different particular art is judged by its own style of beauty, and because it's just by its own aesthetics, for example, it's better if it's better accessibility in regard to how many artists can actually opt into this, right? Because most likely, if you're only talking about politics because you have more wider room of arsenal or wider room of topics that you can talk about, rather than limit the scope of politics, we only talk about certain things, for example, meaning that there is less likely chances for smaller artists, for example, with, for example, big artists. So because all those reasons, we are very proud to propose. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition, for that fine speech. I welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
Hey, can it be heard?
Yep, you're audible.
Great. POI through chat, taking one from Tere. If anyone else has POI, like feel free to shoot as well. Judith Beheading Holofernes is a painting depicting murder against a sexual assaulter by a woman. The content of it includes gore and violence. And these kinds of arts that are legitimate forms of expression for the artist can only happen when someone creates an artwork just because they want to do it without any strings, without any shackles, and without any constraints to net positive or net negative utility, which otherwise exists in opposition, which otherwise was utilized by regimes like Nazi Germany and Fidel Castro in Cuba to repress freedom of expression and to repress aesthetic value by artists. We don't want to live in this particular world. We think art as artists, we want to make any form of art that we think we want to make, for example, the principle and the philosophy that we want to adopt or want to celebrate under opening government. Three things. One, I'm going to talk about a single piece of framing, proving that opposition idea of utilitarianism is unfairly defined. Secondly, I'm going to talk about freedom and agency. Lastly, I'm going to talk about why the highlight on aesthetic value is probably something that is good. On framing, utilitarianism is portrayed in an unfair and irresponsible manner from opposition. Emotional responses, advocacy, social changes are not in and of itself a utility, insofar as they cannot necessarily prove that it brings more positive benefit rather than bad impact, right? This is why my POI to LO was very important, because while they didn't answer my question, we want to exclusively posit that the burden from opposition is not to prove why art should be impactful, but to prove why art should be positively impactful, or they have a positive utility compared to the negative outcome that they have. This means that repressing a lot of art that are deemed by the society, for example, to have more negative value, to invoke more negative emotional responses from the majority of people, this also kicks out their argument of, oh, you know what, art can be used to support feminism and stuff like that. Insofar as the majority of people still hate the idea of, for example, feminism, a lot of misogynistic individuals still hate the idea of feminism, for example, seeing them as feminazis, whatever, the emotional response that happens on your side of the house will not be considered a utility or be considered a net negative. Otherwise, you have no benefit of opposition. Second thing I want to talk about is freedom and agency, right? What did it tell you? It tell you that, first of all, art is a form of creation by the artist. This means that the content or the form of the art is a form of creativity by the artist and shouldn't be shackled by arbitrary manners that external individuals, for example, people outside of our artist community, impose towards our artist community, for example, labeling that what we do should be impactful against the society or should be utilized in a certain manner for a certain particular purpose. But the second thing we also talk about was that art is made as a manifestation of all the complexities that influence how individuals think, for example, and the art that we as artists create are forms of every single complexities that are mixed up together in our particular head, and we want to deliver those kinds of art. We want to make those into words, for example, into paintings, into brushes of color, whatever, that otherwise that showcases the particular artistic value that we have and is unique to artist community. Then opposition said, artists are tired by capitalism. Exactly then, right? This is all the more reason for someone to freely express themselves however they might think. But then also their benefit argues, we get more funding, right? I'm going to deal with this later, but I just want to flag right now that this is at best discriminative, because what you only get from opposition is that a couple of artists who happen to have, for example, those specific knowledges, artists who happen to have exposure and influences towards those certain particular issues should be respected in a particular artist community. It's imperative to know that artist community are not, homogeneous in nature. We consist of the different vast majority of artists, for example, coming from vastly different demography, and insofar as they cannot prove why that's an interest that fulfills every single person in artistic community, and why that's the homogeneous goal that every single artist in our community wants to get their benefit, should not stand. The last thing I want to talk about is highlight on aesthetic value. This is very important, right? Because it basically means that we enjoy art not because of the message, but because of the form of the work that is especially artful and skillful in conveying the message. I'm going to talk about two things here. First of all, let's talk about the way, right? Because like largely it was unresponded by opposition anyway. I'm going to remind you why this is important. Within like aesthetic values should be primarily important because of three reasons. One, it explains why, we find good art to be non-replicable, right? So we cannot replicate the effects of good art, for example, or essay in the same exact subject of Judith beheading Holofernes that I mentioned before, because you don't get the formal elements or like the interaction between the formal elements and the contents, for example. You cannot necessarily replicate the original the original art that someone makes because of the aesthetic value and because of the combination of lights and textures and whatever. And this is specifically good for artist community because generally, like we hate plagiarism, for example. We hate copying on previous artwork. So presumably this is good because like aesthetic values are what makes original art much better compared to the later arts, because like surely message could be replicated, but the aestheticism of the art cannot. The second reason why the aesthetic value is primarily important is because it allows us to explain why a lot of people can appreciate artworks even if they disagree with the particular message behind it. Why? Because they find the value of the art piece to be in the formal and technical aspects of the particular art, the beauty that it radiates, for example, compared to the message or advocacy or whatever the opposition wants. For example, we're talking about a lot of religious paintings like the Last Supper, right? We're talking about theater depicting of Virgin Mary cradling Jesus' dead body. Even in these particular arts, even non-religious individuals or people opposing religion, for example, can and they actually do appreciate these religious art pieces, even if they might otherwise in their life oppose the idea of religion or organized religion to begin with. And this is because it's beautifully done. For example, it perfectly matches with the content that we're trying to portray with this particular art. So this is particular something good, and this is generally good, right? Because as an artist, you want to deliver your message so as many people as possible to enjoy your work. We prevent backlashes for at any point cover opposition. Closing go if you have 3, 2. No PI. Great. Yeah. So generally, this is good because you have less backlash, you have less opposition based on your freedom. The last thing why this is good is that it's a unique benefit because even taking opposition at their best, you get advocacies and a lot of other things, emotional responses, right? All of the utilitarian benefits have their own specific alternatives to achieve this particular method, like goal. Aesthetic value, beauty, and enjoyment in listening to a certain music or observing a certain texture in painting is unique and has been both logically and empirically proven to be appealing to individuals. So even if other alternatives exist, we posit that they're insufficient at best. And as artists, we want to boast the unique quality that we have that outweighs the other particular alternatives. Because even if it's true that opposition can prove that it's a good technique for tactics for advocacy, it's never proven why it's more effective compared to other forms of advocacy. At least in our side of the house, the unique benefit of beauty and aesthetic value, for example, is much more important and much more boastable compared to the other qualities that might exist otherwise in 3 other benches. What is the problem with the counterfactual? First, we told you the problem of limitation of agency. But second, even if you don't buy that, and I dare you not to buy that, we argue that there will be a massive shift of focus on the counterfactual because people will no longer look at the of the texture of the aestheticism of the particular art. They're trying to depict, they're trying to talk about the message behind the particular art, which most likely is not what we want to deliver at first by the artist. This means that there's a trade-off we need to establish. Opposition cannot posit that they have both. We posit that it's more important to have aesthetic value and freedom as artist community propose.
the member of government to open the closing half.
Okay, wait 1 minute.
Okay.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep, you're audible.
All right. For POI preferences, I would rather you to unmute yourself and not texting because I'm not gonna check the text. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think it's important to open this debate by asking one question. What makes art valuable? And there are 3 ways for you to make art valuable. There are difference value of art, which means there are aesthetic value, there are cognitive and experiential value of art. All of this is not depend. However, the problem in the current status quo is that all of this value, regardless whether it's the value of art or it's the cognitive value of art or the experience you felt through processing art, it is not dependent on the existence of the art per se, but how individuals perceive art and how individuals like describe their art to begin with. That is not art. That is just how that is not something that you can derive from the art. That is something that you derive from words, and that's something that you derive from explanation. That is an abstract art might not have a set political meaning, but like under our side, the experiential value that one individual felt through the emotions can still be evoked by this painting because it existed through their experience to seeing the painting to begin with, right? The distinction under CG is different. So it's not true that under opening opposition that suddenly individuals cannot subject meaning and artists cannot subject meanings to their works. They are just not going to be explicit about it, and the paintings is not going to have like one single explanation to explain what these are, right? Under our side, artists can still make art that personally feels meaningful to them, as opposed to an art that serves like a greater universally meaningful message. Under our side, individuals that perceive art can still subject meanings to art the way they want. The difference is that this meaning will be unique and personal to each individuals, as opposed to a paragraphs that you read on explaining about what this specific art means can still put and subject meaning to that art. The difference is yes, is going to be unique. I appreciate OGs therefore explaining about how art can only be fulfilling when there's no utility concerns in the process of making art. But I think there is something more important than that, right? Which is to put the agency of the meaning on art to not only to the author, but the individuals that perceive art, and to sustain art as an emotionally personal journeys as how art should be. Under CG, we champion the democratization of art and the purification of art that fulfill the essence of it. So I'm going to argue that the entirety of this opposition bench is not talking about art, and they should not be debating this on the basis of like not fulfilling the essence of art. So the first argument will be, why is this justified to celebrate art for the sake of it? The answer is that because it's the most purest form of art. I just want to posit that art exists before the creation of civilization. It existed since the primordial time when humans cannot even communicate through words, but they can carve paintings inside their cave. It existed before the need to portray a political message. It exists prior to the evolution of human needs to serve other individuals. What does this mean? This means that the creation of art is a human nature and should principally be liberated from every single kind of expectations because it existed beforehand, before the necessity to communicate and before the necessity to create a civilization. The question that this positors the entire opening opposition bench, therefore, why then art should have impacts and why then art should have meanings? Because like if art existed before the creation of meanings, that means art should be liberated from the ability for you to create meaning of that art, right? Why is crucially important to note? Because the current status quo is the world progressing to the simplification of art and the utilization of art. This means 3 things. This looks like 3 things, right? For example, we violate architecture beauty by pushing for a minimalist utility-based architecture. We disregard the identity and the aesthetic carving that was a way for artists to, express themselves in an otherwise they are not able to explain through words, because this is the only medium for them to express themselves. We also, for example, violate the essence of music through massive production and an entertainment industry like the K-pop industry that diminish the authenticity of art and rather trying to make art just to fit into a global market and a tool for profit incentive. Thirdly, we also violate the dignity of artists in the current status quo because we stop evaluating art through what makes an art, but rather how art serves other agenda. This looks like having to explain art through A and Z and forgetting that art is about touching something inside you, and sometimes art cannot be explained through words. The moment you try to carve the depth and the magnitude of that art through words and the limitation of our cognitive capacity, that is when you violate the essence of art in itself. And that's why humans do not connect to the art in itself, but they connect through the explanation of the art, and that is not art to begin with, right? This is under opposition. Art is never going to be perceived as how art should be, is never going to fulfill the essence of art. But also that means under opposition that artists can never be appreciated proportionately to what they do, because as opposed to evaluating art through the existence of what they create, they tarnish this with limitation, tarnish this with objectification and distinction and dictions, which art should transcend themselves above, right? This is why under CG, this is the only way that full appreciation of art can only exist under our art. Because firstly, we appreciate artists through his abilities to convey things through abstract things, touching beyond your logical boundaries. Because if you just want to touch people through words, then might as well become an article writer, right? Artists specifically becomes artists because they want to touch a specific element of individuals that are not touched by this limitations that exist in the reality. Second, this means that under our side, we can appreciate art because we understand that art is not as easy as digesting a novel. It's not as easy as digesting an article, for example. Understanding art and color theory, understanding the way how color interacts with the psychological of human is something hard, which means that under our side, the full appreciation of artists is not can exist because under your side you underestimate artists because you can never fully contextualize the skills needed in order for you to make art, never fully comprehend what are the psychological needs for you as an individual to have a creative capacity to make this particular art, right? This means the appreciation of artists can never exist under their side. This only means that if people understand the complexity behind the process of making art, this is when CG can co-op all of opening opposition benefits in regards to funding, in regards to discourse to art, because you understand that art is not as simple as that, because the simplification of art and the underestimation of artists came exactly from the simplification of the complexity of the art creative process, right? But secondly, that a lot of people we believe that the democratization of art is important because we think that art should belong to everyone. In the case that if under your side, minorities artists cannot access art that eventually capture their histories explicitly and specifically, then that means a lot of people under your side could not even relate to the art to begin with. But then under our side, the capacity to individuals to relate their historical and cultural junctures towards a particular art is much bigger, right? Because there's no limitation about what art this art should mean. That this individual can take a meaning on its own, and therefore the capacity of individuals and minorities to relate to a specific type of art can only exist under our side when we can preserve the democratization of art, when we can preserve the meaning and the interpretation of art is not something that others should control, but rather something that the perception that the individuals who consume art can put meaning and subject themselves into. The democratization of art makes art much more accessible to minorities, makes art much more accessible to individuals, and for all of this reason, artists can only be fully appreciated under our side. As an artist, I'm so proud to propose.
Thank you for that fine speech, Member of Government. I now welcome the Member of Opposition.
Tes, am I audible? Oke, kalau seandainya suaranya kekat di tengah, just cut my speech karena lagi di cafe, sinyalnya unstabil, terus mic-nya burik. I will only accept POI from Justin, so sorry, Ca. No gender pronouns, true chat. Jangan di-unmute. I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. one. Several important setup in closing opposition. One, under our side, we oppose the art for the art's sake philosophy. So we don't want to live in the world when art should be created for no other reason but itself. So how art will look like under our side? As an artist, we will make sure that we. Sadly, this debate is not only about that type of artist. Then what is the another interest that closing opposition want to establish? Two, we believe that even though the artist become, then you can gain more. Socio will provide manner of use of utilitarian. We're also talking about the most vulnerable actor. We're talking about entertainers and enjoyers from a minor identity. Then why my contextualization is really important? Because they're talking about self-fulfillment. Because every artist has different motive and reason to opt into this circuit. Because let's be real, this field is full of heterogeneous artists with different background and motive. So CO will be the first team that will enter literally all types of artists and can break the discussion in three tips about principle. We should be champion because I'm really tired from always losing in grand final. One big extension in my speech, all rebuttal. Why as an artist you have responsibility to address social problem in your artwork. That is why art should be utilitarian. What is the context that CEO want to establish? Artists have historically used the various tools at their disposal to communicate issue of importance and provoke the society. The issues that art has been used to deal with include but not limited to war, violence, racism, and inequality, to name but a few. What makes art such an effective tool in addressing social issue is its ability to the end of art. In light of the significant power that art and by extension artists hold, this arises the question of whether artists have a responsibility to address social problem through their works. My speech shall argue that artists do have the responsibility to address social problem in their work because of two big layers. One, in principle, you indebted towards the past artists that take value for the tool of social improvement. CEO talked about in 1910 when Ai Weiwei criticized Mao Zedong era through her art because she thinks that oppressive regime disenfranchised society as a whole. A lot of artists in the past taking big risks to get oppressive majority and unfair norm in society through their art. They are the one that teach and share their knowledge to society to access art because they want humanity to be better towards art. So that is why in principle, you need to continue this legacy and goal as an artist because the reason right now you can be artist, you have knowledge and skill, you have platform to channeling your passion, you have name and platform to paint and make song. This is because past effort of artists. What is the real parallel example of this narrative? That is why pro bono exists in crucial jobs such as that, because how strong this field affects society, and also in this case art. Without this proof, general public will be content to keep quiet about the issue and act like it was nothing important. Artists offset this by making the public face this controversial issue. It will therefore be irresponsible for the artist to fail to use this great power and platform for the greater good by addressing social problem. This first layer proves why artists care towards social issue, and even if they are not, I prove to you that they have moral responsibility to care with it. This principle also higher than OO because this principle proves why we give shit about minority, because without this layer, their social issue extension in the LO become really weak because the whole government benches can easily ask why we care about minority, fuck them anyway. That is why this principle is the one that make a nice OO's benefit to become strong. But second big layer before that, opening government.
The trade-off is clear in CO compared to OO, but please don't use the principle of responsibility because it is true, so what? We posit the explanation of social change is not only uncertain because I told you the method of utilitarianism is discriminative, but it's also unimportant for the artist insofar as you never prove what's the interest of the artist to begin with.
I think my principle is more important and break the deadlock because your argument is even to some extent same with closing government and deadlock with opening opposition. So this principle is the one that break the deadlock. And even if we want to talk about practical, my second argument in practical, why art is the most powerful tool to create social changes because no alternative work. Or even if another alternative work, the prerequisite of all those alternatives is to let art become effective. Because if government want to talk about another alternative in government waves such as politics, social movement, or education, this platform is a really inaccessible platform to advocate for minority because in most cases, in order for this platform to be effective, it requires starting point. We're talking about demand for politicians that is so uncertain because politics is wishy-washy and pragmatic, or social movement that not accessible towards everyone because most of the time you need to do extreme agenda like demonstration and protest, which not worth it for you as minority, or even if you want to take that, you don't have a capability to do so. Then where is the